They say when America has a cold, Detroit has the flu. And if that's the case, this once booming metropolis has been suffering from pneumonia for quite some time. African Americans make up 83% of Detroit's population, the largest share of the demographic pool of any major U.S. city. Coincidence? We'll investigate. That's today on The Global African, and I'm Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us. So-called revitalization seems to be the buzzword that Detroit politicians are touting when it comes to the once thriving city. Although downtown Detroit is experiencing a turnaround, the fiscal success of the center city isn't trickling down. The reality for most of Detroit's residents, namely African Americans, is this: widespread blight, high unemployment, high poverty rates, and crime. In July of 2013, Detroit became the largest U.S. city in history to file for bankruptcy, facing a debt of somewhere between $18 to $20 billion, opening the door for Michigan Governor Rick Snyder to appoint Kevin Orr as the city's emergency manager. Subsequently, Snyder would amend legislation to give his position power over most of Detroit's financial matters, in turn snatching much of the power of Detroit's mayor, Dave Bing. In a shock to many, Governor Snyder mobilized the Republican-dominated legislature to effectively circumvent accountability, exempting the emergency manager from public choice by passing Public Act 436. How does this serve the people of Detroit, who need the most opportunity to rise from circumstances created by a corrupt former local government? How will these steps provide Detroit with a path to renewal? How will these steps actually improve the lives and upward mobility of its largest demographic, namely the African American working class? And we're joined by Dr. Darius Irani. Dr. Irani is the chief economist for the Regional Economic Studies Institute at Towson University. In this capacity, he has undertaken numerous research projects examining local economic performance for several regions and cities, such as Detroit, Michigan. Dr. Irani, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me today, Bill.
Dr. Irani, I've visited Detroit, or have visited Detroit, many times in the last 30 years, and feel that I'm, in many ways, looking at a city that's disintegrating. How would you describe for our viewers the policy issues or the factors that have contributed to where Detroit is today?
Sure thing, Bill. So the demise of Detroit and some of the other northeastern cities was in the 1940s. It began sort of as African American workers moved from the South to support the war effort and the industrial plants. As they migrated northward and settled into some areas, some families, white families, left those areas. In the 1950s, that migration sort of really accelerated. More African Americans saw opportunities in these industrial factories to earn and support their families and to achieve the American dream. In the 1960s, we had some riots that took place that sort of accelerated that white flight out of Detroit, sort of leaving Detroit, as you said in the opening, about 83% African American. So that was one, the demographic shift. Then the automobile companies, were the economic engine that drove America, supporting the war effort. As a former GM said, as GM goes, so does America. They began to realize that there were some labor strife issues in Detroit, and they wanted to insure themselves, to insure against that. So they began to move some of their factories out of the city into other states and other cities in Detroit. Well, as sort of the imported cars began to take hold in the early 70s, manufacturers began to cut back their workers. So coming into the 1980s and 1990s, the number of automobile workers diminished tremendously, resulting in a huge loss of income for many blue-collar workers in these areas. This is sort of a thing that's been repeated all across the U.S. in industrial cities in the Northeast, from Baltimore, Akron, Ohio, Detroit being one of them. They've all suffered that diminution in industrial base due to sort of stiff competition from global companies. As a result, the 2013 bankruptcy of Detroit was sort of all but inevitable, given sort of the imbalance between sort of the economics that were underlying sort of the city in terms of the lack of good jobs, the manufacturing base sort of being diminished. These things sort of led to sort of the inevitable 2013 bankruptcy of Detroit.
But was it actually inevitable? I mean, in this sense, it feels like there were forces outside of Detroit that essentially sabotaged any effort at renewal and were pushing the city in a certain direction.
Yes, I mean, there were a lot of social forces, outside the city that were doing it. You have globalization, but I think part of it is the inability for the automobile companies to see beyond the next quarter's profits. So not planning ahead. Quite frankly, the automobile companies, domestic automobile companies, still suffer from the stigma of poor quality even today, even though they might be on par with Japanese-made cars, because of those poor planning decisions made back in the 60s and 70s. We're not going to offer good cars to Americans. So I think these are just a couple of things that have been plaguing the outside forces, but definitely it's short-sighted.
Let me just ask one more question. How do we move people away from the thinking about economic development that seems to work like this? You need to develop your economy, you bring in gambling. You bring in a sports stadium. You reformat your downtown to make it look like the mythical downtown of 50 or 60 years ago.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, that's it.
Right.
So what do we have to do to convince policymakers that something much more dramatic will be necessary?
Both of those policies you've cited, the bringing in a sports team and allowing gambling, are, I would consider to be short-term economic development things. They look very pretty. They provide a lot of fanfare and buzz. But at the end of the day, the number of jobs that are created out of a sports stadium are very minimal outside the athletes. And the number of sort of high-paying, good, sustainable jobs created out of gambling tend to be particularly low. Moreover, gambling sort of is taking money from individuals who are already income challenged and giving it back to the casinos. So I don't view that as a long-term economic strategy. I view that as sort of as a complementary one, but not your principal one. It really is about getting small businesses and entrepreneurs from the local community to grow their businesses. That is where the economic engine will go, and it's sustainable. We cannot have an industry based solely on services of gambling and sports. We have to have an industry that is well balanced and provides opportunities for individuals.
Dr. Irani, thank you very, very much for
Thank
this.
you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you, and we'll be back in a moment to the Global African. Joining us to discuss the Detroit problem or crisis is Elena Harada. Elena is an elected school board member at the Detroit Public Schools, as well as an adjunct faculty at Wayne County Community College. Elena is active in restoring governance for Detroit. Welcome to the program, Elena.
Thank you.
In terms of the crisis in Detroit, the Detroit Public Schools recently authorized cuts in funding. What does this represent? Where is this coming from, and how do you see this as affecting the Detroit Public Schools?
Well, first of all, the state of Michigan took over our schools. I'm an elected school board member, but we have no authority. And we actually voted against the loan that the district needed in order to start up again this year because of the terrible squandering that it's done with our finances in the 67 months that it's been in charge. So for the last 5 years, the emergency manager has tripled our debt and closed more than half of our schools, including some of our best schools. They took 15 schools out of Detroit Public Schools and gave them to an experiment called the Educational Achievement Authority, which is a very separate and very unequal school district for the poorest students, mainly the ones who had no choice but to go anywhere else. So we're in a position now of losing another 20 schools this year. And what it really is the privatization of public education. So they told us they're going to put 43 students in a classroom, and these are our poorest children. Remember that these are the children who need the most, who are now going to be put in a classroom with 43 students each. And this district has not announced which schools would close. So for people looking for schools to put their children in, they don't know if the school is going to be open or not. So this is another tactic of ethnic cleansing in Detroit to make the poorest people, mostly Black people, leave Detroit because they need to go where the schools are.
Elena, what can you tell us about the response of teachers and parents to these cuts that have been that have taken place?
Well, it's interesting. The teachers are having rallies. Several years ago, it was outlawed for them to strike, and there's a huge fine levied on them if they strike. So I'm sure most of them are afraid to go out on strike. Something like $1,500 a day. That was done under Governor Engler. So they're not likely to go on strike, but there's so many unemployed teachers that they would get, everybody would just go get jobs if there was a teacher strike in DPS. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that parents are being courted by DPS to get their kids into school after they've seen on the news that there's going to be 43 students in a class. So they're being courted to come into schools and telling them that there's these wonderful programs, but they see that everything's been cut and the teachers have had their salaries cut now by 20% in the last 5 years.
Who is this emergency manager, Jack Martin, and what is his role in this whole situation?
He's actually about the fourth emergency manager we've had in this. They should be understood as kind of like mercenaries. They go from city to city, and they do the bidding of the governor that put them in place, which is Snyder. But they don't really have any role except to do what they're told. So they appointed a member to our school board, our elected school board, and we've sued for that. And the judges just keep kicking the can down the corner, so we never get a court date. But they actually appointed someone to an elected seat. And it's real personal to me because it's somebody that I beat twice. So the voters defeated him. He had been on the board before and was known to be corrupt. And the emergency manager appointed him because on a particular date, after 18 months, the emergency manager has to be voted in or out. That day is coming up for us, and his last day is actually September the 29th of this month. So what they try to do is stack the board with members that will support them. And we have a narrow majority right now because they hire away people and give them jobs, or they give them little incentives, so that there are people who are ingratiating themselves to the emergency manager. But we have a very strong majority of people who we don't get paid, and we will not give up the right to governance without a fight.
Elena, I want to thank you very much for joining us in this program. This is incredibly disturbing, something that perhaps could be described, as you and I have discussed in the past, as a slow-moving coup d'etat or friendly-faced authoritarianism.
Right.
And the lessons are very profound for the rest of this country. I appreciate you taking this time to talk with us.
Thank you very much. I hope we talk more.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us on this segment of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. And we're joined by Reverend David Bullock. Reverend Bullock is the pastor of the Greater St. Matthew Baptist Church in Detroit. He is also the founder and national spokesperson for the Change Agent Consortium, a coalition of faith, labor, civil rights organizations, and active citizens. So welcome, Reverend Bullock, to our program.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill. Good to be here.
Our pleasure. I was doing an interview with someone about Detroit, and in listening to the description, it sounded like Detroit had been the victim of a slow-motion coup d'etat. And I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit about what's happened there, this emergency manager, Kevin Orr, and actually how he came to power?
No, great question, and I think great description of a coup d'etat. The government has been taken from the people, and now there's one man rule in the city of Detroit. Kevin Orr is the emergency manager. He has complete control of the government, and I might add that there are emergency managers in other states across Michigan. This is Governor Rick Snyder's urban policy. His response to the need for economic development and for fighting poverty and improving education in Michigan has been to depress democracy, install an emergency manager either in a school district or a city, and that emergency manager has the ability to sell assets, to fire city workers, to bust unions, to change work rules. Basically, you have dictatorship where there once was democracy, and there's no accountability. I mean, we don't elect the emergency manager. The elected officials have no control over the emergency manager. And so what you're seeing in Detroit and across Michigan is an unprecedented switch from democracy to dictatorship.
So correct me if I'm wrong. Detroit technically has a mayor, but it also has this emergency manager who's sort of like an apparition hanging in the background.
Detroit has a mayor, newly elected Mayor Mike Duggan. Detroit has a city council, newly elected city council. Detroit just paid for 2 years ago a new charter to run the city, has new police commissioners. And unfortunately, the emergency manager is not hanging in the background. The emergency manager is right up front because none of those elected officials have any power unless the emergency manager gives them power. So the mayor has to ask the emergency manager for authority. City council has to ask the emergency manager for authority. The city charter doesn't even matter at this point. The police chief reports to the emergency manager. All of city government is under the auspices of the offices of the emergency manager. So basically in Detroit is you have a sham government because the elected officials have no power. They're shadow figures. And the real authority in Detroit is Kevin Orr.
Now, recently in the news, there was mention of this whole water shutoff crisis. Very little detail was given as to what this was all about. Can you just provide some background? What exactly was this about and what happened?
Well, first, the water department, the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, is under the direction of the emergency manager. Now, that has since changed. The emergency manager has let the mayor actually take over the water department operations. But while the shutoffs were happening, in large measure, while that story was being reported, Kevin Orr was in charge of the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. In March, they announced that they were going to start shutting off about 3,000 customers in Detroit a week. And those customers owed anywhere between $60 to $150. Now, the water rates in Detroit have increased 131% in the last 10 years. There was an increase this year of 8.7%. And so you see the cost of water going up, but you have economic depravity and quality of life going down. And so basically this was first the emergency manager, and so we believe attacking the most vulnerable. But once we started investigating this, we discovered that there was a potential privatization of the water department on the table, potential regionalization of the water department on the table. And of course, you can't privatize anything if you can't show that debt is collectible, that billing works, that folks can be forced to pay. And so instead of going after the corporations that had large commercial bills, had unpaid stormwater runoff bills, unpaid water bills, instead of going after, say, Ford Field for the $55,000, or even the city of Detroit that has a multi-million-dollar bill, we saw the emergency manager give the instruction and order for the Detroit Water and Sewage Department to go after the most vulnerable customers, namely those who are in the city of Detroit.
Now, another site of struggle in Detroit has been in connection with pension funds.
That's right.
And there's been a great deal of attention to this, attacks on pension funds and the response of the unions. What is at stake? What is going on here? Why are the pension funds under assault? And what is is there more than just complaining in response? Is there resistance?
Well, the pension funds are under attack. One, because Michigan, in terms of its state constitution, has some of the strongest legal language to guarantee the promise of the pension. If you can bust that up in Michigan, well, then you can take that traveling circus across the nation. And so Michigan and Detroit become ground zero for this fight about how do you promote austerity measures? Do you promote them on the backs of corporations, or do you promote them on the backs of citizens? Now we've seen in Michigan this successful move to scapegoat public sector workers, namely city workers, and act as if the promised pension is the reason why the city is in the financial crisis that it's in. And so while government has circled the wagons around the Detroit Institute of Art protecting Picasso and other paintings, they've gone after the pensioners, and now pensioners get a raw deal. They have to pay more for their health benefits. They get a reduced pension. And we're talking about folks who already are not getting a lot in their pension and who really cannot work again. I mean, so this is a bad deal. Now you asked the right question. Is there resistance? Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, we have not seen the kind of sustained direct action in Detroit that we are seeing in Ferguson, Missouri. Unfortunately, Detroit is almost a one-hit wonder. You have a great rally, everybody goes home, great press conference, everybody's go home. While there's been a kind of sustained grassroots rumbling, we are still fighting to find the kind of broad-based momentum in Detroit that will cause the masses to come into the streets and say enough is enough.
Is it me, or is there some sort of sick irony that at the same time that this austerity is being imposed upon the people of Detroit, there are tax breaks, there are deals that are being cut with sports establishments to encourage them to come to Detroit?
No, I mean, it is a sick irony. It's a selfish sarcasm. While on the one hand, Mike Ilitch has gotten public money to build a hockey stadium metroplex. And when you look at the deal, you notice that some of that public money actually was supposed to go to education, but the state of Michigan changed the law, while at the same time, teachers in the Detroit public school system have had to take a 20% pay cut, and they're going to fill up the classroom so that there are 40 kids per class and close about 26 schools. And so you see money being diverted from education to economic development for corporate titans who don't even need the corporate welfare. I mean, something's really wrong in the city of Detroit. Look at the bankruptcy. It's an economic engine for Jones Day Law Firm, multi-million-dollar contract. Conway McKenzie, multi-million-dollar contract, and other research and legal firms. Ernst & Young, multi-million-dollar contracts being made on the heels of the bankruptcy, but then the bankruptcy doesn't even have any tangible provision in it to fund improved city services, to create jobs, to bring capital investment into areas that typically are overlooked, to deal with insurance redlining, to mitigate the consequences of the foreclosure crisis. And so the bankruptcy is not going to help anybody except the lawyers and the research firms. So we continue to see austerity actually meaning in practice corporate welfare. And so people who are against welfare for poor people are for welfare for corporate entities. And folks have to wake up and see what's going on. This is not just about Detroit. This is not just about Michigan. This is going to move across the nation. Nobody is safe. We've got to wake up in Detroit, but we've got to wake up in the United States of America.
Reverend Bullock, thank you so very much for taking the time to spend with us to discuss this slow-moving coup d'etat in the city of Detroit.
Bill, thank you so much for having us.
And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Global African. I'm Bill Fletcher, your host. See you next time.